turnout.
There's been 10 more people.
Oh, that's good.
Welcome everybody in the room at the Wheeler Centre and also live streaming with us wherever you are around Australia and the rest of the world potentially. I'm Fiona Toomey, Artistic Director of the Other Film Festival. To begin, I would like to acknowledge the First Nations, first storytellers and traditional owners of the land, of this land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to all elders here this evening. We acknowledge that the land we meet on remembers the stories passed from palm to palm through thousands of generations. We acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. We acknowledge that our histories interweave. We acknowledge not only past histories, but the present and future. We celebrate the First Nations stories that are being told today that we are still learning from. Before I introduce the panel, I just have a little bit of housekeeping, and that is to say tonight's event is proudly presented in partnership between the Other Film Festival, Arts Access Victoria and the Wheeler Centre, and with support from the City of Melbourne and Screen Australia. There is a quiet room located on level 4, and it can be accessed via the lift next to reception. The Wheeler Centre staff are available within the room to provide assistance with any other venue-related matters. You may already have a complimentary drink, but there will be also more drinks after the event, so we invite everyone to stay around afterwards. And I'm going to get the panel to introduce themselves, and we have first off Carly Finlay.
Hi, I'm a writer, a speaker, appearance activist. I want to read out a tweet from my mum, who I did not know was so much of an activist until today. She has been tweeting Scott Morrison about the drought. She says, "Please keep your promises and stop being so dishonest, Scott Morrison. I can't believe how awful I feel after meeting you twice in 2019 and how insincere you are. And this is personal." She also
lives in regional
New South Wales, and she in Albury, near Albury, and she also met Scott twice. I didn't know she met him twice. I knew she met him once at the conference where he was egged. It was not her egg. She has chickens, but I can confirm it was not her egg. But apparently he's made a lot of promises to the CWA, and he has not delivered. So she was tweeting on behalf of the CWA. I don't know if she's allowed, but she was. And she said that she's very disappointed that he did not deliver on his promise to the CWA, which is the Country Women's Association. So go my mum.
Go Jeanette.
Jeanette.
So next in the middle here we have Andy Jackson.
Hi, I'm Andy Jackson from Castlemaine. I've lived in Melbourne for a long time before that, but I live in Central Victoria, and I'm a poet, and as we were saying before, I juggle many other things to get money, because poetry doesn't involve money. And just also want to say I'm really glad that we had the acknowledgement of country, because I think that's one of the things about this land particularly, that we need to learn how to be here. And that's a huge kind of aspect, part of that, to learn from the people who know the country. So, yeah.
Thank you, Andy. And then we have CB Mako, or Cubby, as I affectionately know you as.
Yeah, hi, I'm CB Mako. That's my pen name, but my friends call me Cubby. And I just like to acknowledge that as a migrant and a person of color, I acknowledge I'm an uninvited guest who lives in the stolen, unceded lands of the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging, and all those who are watching the live stream and who are in this room this afternoon or this evening. So always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I'm with a group which is newly formed called Disabled Q BIPOC Collective. If you haven't heard of the acronym BIPOC or BIPOC, meaning Black, Indigenous, People of Color. So I'm 1/4 of that collective, and 3 of them is in a concurrent event called Visibility, which is on the west side of Melbourne right now happening. So I'm here to represent my collective as well.
Thank you, Cubby. And Leafa.
Hi, I am Leafa Singleton Norton. I'm a writer and also a climate activist in my personal life, and I've done work across both the environmental and political spheres and creative spheres as well.
Thank you, Leafa.
I just forgot something.
That's
Sorry.
okay, Carly.
I am editing Growing Up Disabled in Australia, and 2 of our panellists are in the book, Andy Jackson and Cubby Mako. That'll be out in June next year.
It's very exciting. So we're all here to talk about climate change, disability and storytelling, so we're going to get down to it now. So the United Nations Human Rights Council in July 2019 adopted a resolution on climate change and the rights of people with disabilities. The resolution calls on governments to adopt a disability inclusive approach when taking actions to address climate change. So I'm going to start with Leafa. So given your background in environmental activism, do you want to just give a response, and we're aware of a time limit? No,
Sure.
no, only because just to the UN resolution, but particularly in an Australian context.
Yes. This was a really pivotal moment, I think, in acknowledging where we're at, probably in terms of the climate crisis as it relates to vulnerable communities. There's previously been a particular effort by the UN in the information that they've been putting out in other resolutions to make resolutions particularly around other marginalised or vulnerable groups, such as Indigenous people or women. But up until this point, there hadn't really been a particular attention paid to the vulnerability of disabled people when it comes to the coming climate crisis and the climate crisis that we're living in currently. So it was quite a significant moment, I think, to really push that dialogue forward. It's something that has been happening. I would say probably the biggest thing that brought it to people's attention was probably Hurricane Katrina. There was some really big public instances of people with disabilities being left behind or suffering far more than their counterparts, which was quite shocking, I think, but it really drew attention to the fact that there were frameworks in place that were happening in massive climate crisis that did not prioritise the needs of disabled people. So that's a long time ago. For that conversation to have stalled for a very long time, I think is something the UN has acknowledged by putting this resolution out. And it really calls for things like that are familiar to the disability movement. So it calls for inclusion, and not just inclusion. People with disabilities need to be considered, but people with disabilities need to be involved from the very first moment that we start having discussions around the climate crisis, particularly as it relates to climate catastrophe and events, that disabled people need to be involved in the planning, they need to be involved in the conversations that are happening around these crises, and that their rights should be as integral and as prioritised as the rights of other communities, other marginalised communities, but also the majority of people who these kinds of disaster plans, for example, are drawn up for. So it's, I think, a pretty watershed moment for this movement to be given the attention that it deserves.
And we'll get back to this later, but it's interesting too in that it was calling on governments. So we live in a country where we do have quite a bit of, officially, dare we say, denial around that, so around climate change or crisis. So we'll come back to that. Thank you. So Cubby, why is it important that there is a deaf and disabled lens on climate issues? And obviously this is something we're acknowledging on our panel tonight, we are talking from our own lived experience, but we are also trying to place things in a wider framework.
Actually, it's very, very relevant for us right now in the family because we're doing our NDIS review and we're also doing our goals for 2020. And it actually, we wrote down, can we climate proof our home? Can we, if there's thunderstorm asthma, why isn't NDIS mentioning about this? So we wanted infrastructure, or we wanted things to put in the house that would help us breathe better on a climate crisis or in a thunderstorm asthma event. And we want to include that in our NDIS goals. So, but unfortunately, I don't know why they're not mentioning it. So good luck to us if we get those things that we need to get through climate change. But yeah, actually, before the term climate change, climate emergency, these names were coined. This before they were named, we were actually experiencing them more than like a decade ago. Even as I was born, like say, back in the 80s and 70s, when I was growing up, my first concept of, say, a river, or the local creek where my grandma lives, was actually inky and liquid oil. That was my first memory. So there was already that concept of climate change happening in where I came from, which is, I'm actually wearing a Filipino barong, that's what they call it. So that's from where my island is. Yeah, and my first view of the sky is ash clouds, so, and plumes of smoke. So this wasn't named back then, but then we just say it's pollution. But then that was our reality in a developing country until, yeah, we moved here. Oh, okay, rivers are not inky and liquid oil. Okay, so that's not normal. Okay, so that's unfortunately part of, I have to say though, in reality, it's part of colonization. We came from a country that were colonized by 3 different colonizers. So all of their factories sit beside rivers and the sea, and now it's so polluted. But yeah, climate change was happening back then in the islands, in the Pacific.
No, thank you, Cubby. And so Carly, so we're going to, for you, just talk a little bit about the individual impact that yourself as a disabled woman experiences, but that often, I mean, the classic thing is that we, part of it we see a lot is, oh, let's just ban straws. And many of you in the room would know and watching how that, certainly may help the environment, but for some people with disability, plastic straws is the only option.
Yeah.
And so being the point that sometimes, like you said, that sometimes some of the things that are seen as a given in terms of the climate movement actually aren't inclusive and accessible.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of arguments around the straw ban, and they're not accessible to people who have swallowing difficulties or mobility difficulties. And also there's the argument against prepackaged fruit and vegetables where they're cut for convenience, and lots of people scoff at the idea of, a pre-cut pineapple, but that could help someone who is unable to cut things. On a personal level, for me, I use paraffin to keep myself moisturised. It's a life-saving thing. I go through about 5 kilos a month. So not only the tubs, so there's 1 tub per 500 grams, but also the paraffin itself, it's a huge impact. I don't know how many kilos I've gone through in my lifetime, but if it's 5 kilos a month, that's a lot. I'm not very good at maths, sorry. But yeah, and there's also, I feel like there's an expectation, I guess, or an idea that disabled people are burdens because we're, relying on the medical system, which might, test on animals or have a big impact on the environment, but we need these things to survive. Just recently, there was a call to ban asthma puffers because of the CO2 emissions from the puffer, and that's impossible. On a personal level, I think I have experienced huge distress from the heat, from the rising heat, and I've come to carry around a cool pack now in the summer. I did an event here earlier in the year and it was about 45 degrees, and before, I had to remain a professional on stage, but before the event I was lying on the floor in the toilet trying to cool my heart down because I felt like my heart was going to explode because of the heat. My body does not regulate its temperature very well. My sweat glands do not work like most of yours would, and so it's very, very hard. When there's a water crisis and there's limitations on how much water you can use, I sometimes have 3 showers a day. So it's very hard to reconcile medical needs with the need to reduce our impact on the environment. But I think we can do that in other ways. I don't drive my car very often. I try to put all my stuff in the recycling. I minimise my food waste by making stock out of my vegetable scraps. But I don't think that we should be bearing the so-called burden of being the ones to give up the medical need.
No, thank you for that. And I should say with our panel too, I feel like it is the start of a conversation, and we're not going to have necessarily be focused on lots of solutions. It's actually really trying to open up the narrative, and we'll talk more about that too. But I'll go to Andy now. And so living in regional Victoria, extreme weather and the potential of bushfires is very much a real and sometimes daily threat. Al Gibbs, who's a revered disabled writer and activist based in New South Wales, and who's writing a lot about climate change, and a particular article calling for climate justice for disabled people, outlines a number of issues, including how the bushfire survival plan in New South Wales does not directly address access requirements. So what is your perspective, particularly not being a bushfire expert, but living regionally in bushfires, about access and for deaf and disabled people, but very much coming initially from your lived experience?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think it was really interesting. I was born in Central Victoria and moved back there about 4 years ago. And just that part of it is when you live in outside Melbourne, there is a sense for me that you can really see the changes really immediately, and also there is a really palpable sense in the community about vulnerability and people being aware that there is a risk, it's a heightened risk, and it's increasing all the time. I won't mention particular people, but I know people who are who use wheelchairs, who live in my region, who just are moving out because they don't feel confident that there will be people to help them escape. So, and the people that I'm thinking of are perhaps lucky enough to have somewhere else to go. There are other people who are poor, they're renting, they're not really able to, I think I'll move down to my apartment, So there's the obvious kind of life-threatening risk of, what if something catastrophic happens and are you going to get help to get out? But also just the low-level anxiety of living with that uncertainty, which actually I kind of think it's interesting. Like we often talk about how there's people who are disabled and people who are temporarily able-bodied. That we're all vulnerable to becoming disabled. But I think with the kind of coming and arriving climate crisis that we're in, I think a lot of people are experiencing more anxiety, more depression, more fear, and that's something that, we're kind of all in it together. So And yet, you know, at the same time, there are people that are more privileged and more able to, to feel safe and to be safe. So, yeah, as you said before, there's lots of questions and at the moment, not a lot of answers. So, yeah.
No, thank you for that. So I'm mindful too that being part of the reason we conceived this panel and was linking back to the objectives of the other film festival as well. And we do a lot of screen advocacy, but also very much about authentic storytelling, casting behind the scenes as well. And I think it's coming up to 3 years ago, but I was in the initial Screen Australia's program, and they just ran the third one last week, Develop the Developer. And the whole concept about that is bringing marginalised people into a room, and you know, I already had experience, but a lot of it was for others too, is training up to be what's called a developer, which is a story developer. So we're really getting to the start of when ideas are conceived for the screen. But I'm very much aware within a disability space, and I suppose too coming from, working from its inaugural time on the Writability program, the Rise of Disability program, which Andy now works in this building for like over 5 years, that within there are just so many disabled writers and voices and people out there. So I think that meeting up, predominantly on the panel we have, you know, dare I say, literary writers, which is, you know, and you can always transition across to screen. But but I think it's about, and that's the other thing we acknowledge too, is about being open to where writers come from. But also another thing that happens in screen, and very much in a disability documentary concept, is this whole concept of social impact. So something like the documentary 2040 that's out at the moment and very successful is conceived to directly try and address a social issue of climate change. So Lefa, I suppose is interesting, and we're just talking at the back too, of how you've seen people really kind of claiming storytelling and narrative to make a difference, and very much it's sometimes to that head and heart connection.
Absolutely. I think it's something that activism in general is getting better at, and particularly the climate movement is getting better at acknowledging that people connect to stories. And so, you know, for a lot of us, we might know the data. For a lot of us, we might have an idea of, you know, what the ramifications are going to be to our country or to the globe as a whole. But when we actually let people tell their own stories about what it is like to experience, you know, for example, one of the things that I think has been really powerful in the climate movement is people started to talk about the vulnerability of Pacific nations. And at first that was very much coming from some, you know, bigger organisations saying this is happening. The most powerful thing I ever saw was Tuvaluan people here in Australia talking about their experiences. What it's like to be there now, what they're worried about, the fact that they literally will have no land left. And that personal story was far more powerful than hearing about how many years it will take or what will happen eventually. It was hearing those people not just talking about those ramifications, but actually their own connection to their land, the importance of why one, you know, tiny island speaks to the bigger issues of the climate movement. I think those kinds of storytelling are definitely reaching people through climate activism, and I think climate activists focus more on talking about stories of people and place now. But I also think that even more so, I think it's been heightened in the last little while with groups like Extinction Rebellion, which have some problems in terms of the way that they engage with marginalised groups and communities. But the thing that they are doing incredibly well, that seems to be drawing people in, is actually talking about climate change and making a protest itself be a story. And so you'll see Extinction Rebellion conducting die-ins where they're literally providing a tableau and they're saying, here we are, we're literally dying from the climate crisis. Or they will have a big, beautiful parade full of sea life that they're drawing attention to and saying these are the sea creatures that are dying at the moment. Or they'll have a dance performance piece. And I think there have been a huge amount of people who've been drawn into that kind of storytelling and that kind of activism because they feel empowered being part of telling a story. And I think that's something that when it comes to disability, it's great that there's been more development of individual voices so that we have a lot more disabled people telling their own stories. But also we know that disabled people are so much more vulnerable to climate change. It's a particularly vulnerable community. And so some of those stories coming to the front in the next little while I think will be really interesting. And I was really interested to hear about Andy's project, for example, which I think is, you know, exactly what we need at the moment. These kinds of stories that make it clear and talk about that individual experience.
So we might go to, it was a good segue, right, into Andy.
Yeah, that was
And
like a scripted.
I might, because this is what I read this earlier in the year, and I was like, okay, Andy's going to be on this panel. But so you've got funded through Creative Victoria to develop a new series of poems that explore the connections between disability and climate change by connecting the breaking and survival of the body to the breaking and survival of the planet. I just wanted to read that out because it's so beautiful.
Yeah.
Well,
Should I
beautiful
just
but
leave it at
poignant.
that? Like, no, I'm going to. I will be writing these poems. At the moment, there's a few notes and thoughts. I think the reason I came to it partly was living around where there was been a lot of gold mining. Apparently, I only found this out recently, but quite a long time ago, when the gold rush was happening, the local Indigenous people at Djadjawurrung basically started referring to it as upside down country, because what was underneath the land was sort of just dredged up, and became this kind of lunar landscape. And on one level, you can see the land, its brokenness and its woundedness, and there's some kind of suffering there, but it also survives, and it's vigorous, and it keeps going, and it's resilient. And all those qualities that I recognise in other disabled people, that in spite of the hurdles, there's a kind of ingenuity and a sense of finding solutions. And so in a way, I was really interested, not in sort of saying that they're the same thing, but really just trying to write some poems on both of those areas and just allow the connections to kind of happen somehow. So it's early in the project, but like I was saying to you in the green room before, I think it's a bit weird even talking about it as a project, because it really is just something that is totally on my mind all the time. So why not write about it if it's going to be on your mind? So and I do think we need to think more about not only adaptation, but also how do we live together, and how do we be less individualistic, and how do we have an interdependency, and a mutual care, rather than kind of we're all out there on our own with our individual responsibility, being good citizens or good consumers. But how do we respect the agency of the earth and care for each other? It's huge. So I'm not going to solve all that with the poems, but I think I want to give voice to all the questions.
Oh, thank you.
If I could add something to that on the inclusion, it's more of structure as well. We question the structures. For example, in education, I had to fight gatekeepers to have my disabled child included in a mainstream education in primary school. And their language other than English is actually Auslan, which is fantastic. So in case of an emergency, my kid, in, let's say, a fire drill or a fire emergency, or in case of fire, no one's left behind. Everyone is included. So that it's more in structure. So if we're more into mainstream inclusion, all means all. If we could include kids or students with disabilities included in mainstream education, in the structure, and if in case of emergencies, no one is left behind, everyone is included. Because imagine if you're, like what happened in Katrina, that you mentioned that most of our were left behind.
Yep.
So imagine if all the kids included in a class or in a school, no one's going to be left behind, and somebody's going to push your wheelchair. Not your wheelchair will be brought with you, or your asthma medication is going to be brought with you, because that was what happened in, I think, one of the things I've read, in a fire. All their equipment was left behind because they had to be carried into a truck, into a fire truck, and nothing, everything was left behind. So equipment, kids included. So it's more of structure. That's why I believe in inclusion, not just an individual. Because NDIS, we're very lucky. Because if you could go back to the title, taking the charge. We're lucky here in Australia that we have NDIS. In the United States, if the conversation about disabilities is very different because it's very individualistic, it's very capitalist. But here we have actually a system for the disabled, though quite having still lots of growing pains and still lots of teething. But we have NDIS. We need that structure to support everyone. Yep.
And we should look into it because Arts Access Victoria, for example, has done a lot of work, because initially, as you know, in the NDIS, it didn't mention arts and culture at all, and did a lot of work, and now it's starting to mention that, but also to link that up. So, and Arts Access Victoria, not giving it a plug, but is a NDIS provider as well, and I'll be really intrigued. But from what you're saying, even if the words are not in there, it's like at the front line, it's dealing with these things. So, and absolutely everything is systemic. So much is systemic.
I think it's really great that Lefa and also Andy, I guess, raised climate action through storytelling, because as disabled people, not all of us can go to protests physically, and not all of us can, march down the street or sit in or out of a building for hours. I know in September, when the last climate strike was, the school strike for climate was, it was really hot, and that meant I couldn't attend. I mean, many of us couldn't attend because of that, and often we're seen as lazy or letting the team down. But I think we have to note, or everybody has to note, that we can do activism in different ways. And I think you might change the world through your poems, Andy.
Look, I always half joke when I talk that way about poetry, because I do think that every writing, particularly poetry, changes the world for the reader. So, or it also creates this sense of empathy isn't quite the right word, but there's something, some sense of, oh, hang on, maybe there's another way of being in the world that isn't like mine, that's a little bit different.
Well, it comes back down to what is the role of a writer, an artist, a filmmaker in society, and it may not literally be we're going to go out and save a life literally on the street in that way, but maybe it is through finding new narratives, creating space, and changing the centre. At least you're starting to see something happening. And I was going to say too, because what we were talking about, Cubby, particularly with US, and because it's actually, no, you're not Angie, but we have quite a few, Twitter, quite prolific on Twitter. Lefa, Cubby, Carly, myself less so, but I am there. But it was great actually when you and how Alice Wong, and I thought maybe you just wanted to do a shout out, Carly.
Alice is the leader or the governor of Disability Visibility Project, which comprises a Facebook group that is now no longer running, but you can still see it. It's all archived, so if you search Disability Visibility Project on Facebook, you can see what's being posted. It's public. Also, Disability Visibility on Twitter, Instagram, and she runs this amazing podcast called the Disability Visibility Project, where she transcribes all the interviews, and she also does articles on her website. And it's incredible that she brings together so many different people. One of the recent episodes was on climate change, and she had a few disabled people talking about the way they contribute, and in small ways and in big ways, reducing the waste they use, but also they talked about having to use a car because that's the most accessible way for them to get around, for example.
Yeah, and on that podcast, at the end there was some incredible articles and links. So we'll see if we can link those later, because that became an incredible resource to refer to.
She does really great work. You should check her out. She's got a Patreon as well. You should support that.
In terms of the ability for these kinds of stories to change the world, though, I don't think we should discount the fact that they do, because in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, one of the reasons that the FDA in America and now globally that I think you can draw direct links to the UN statement that we started with have come about is because of a documentary called The Right to Rescue. And that documentary really talked about why disabled people, why elderly people, why people who had, potentially just long-term health issues had been left behind during this enormous crisis. And it really asked the kinds of questions that didn't shy away from the tragedy of what happened, but also raised challenges about what needed to change going forward. And very much the kind of takeaway from that was that you need to be thinking about disability from point one, because as you said, you can't think, okay, here I'm going to get this person onto a fire truck and we're going to take them away, but without their equipment that they need to survive, if we can't get that on the truck, what are we going to do? You can't come at it from an end perspective and say, this is what we have, how are we just going to add disability and disabled people onto that? It doesn't work. And so you really need to be thinking about it from the first point of view. And it was really interesting because it brought up lots of things around, we talk about the medical model of disability, for example, and it brought up things around the idea of triage, for example, in hospitals, which, the idea that you should rescue as many people as quickly as possible, and what ramifications that has for people who may be seen as more difficult or having more needs. And so it really challenged some ingrained ideas there that whether they be fire and rescue people or that medical people had about what you need to do in a crisis. And obviously the climate crisis that we're talking about isn't just extreme events, but particularly when it comes to those kinds of extreme events, I think it shows where the cracks are. And that documentary really brought that conversation into the mainstream and made it so that an organisation as significant as the UN, for example, had to say, okay, we haven't dealt with this well enough and we should, and here's how we'll try to move forward. And that's really reset the agenda for that conversation.
And Leifa, does that also, eugenics or the right of a life, dignity of a life come into play there? Where
Absolutely.
People make a judgment over whose life is worth saving?
Yes, and there's a particular case or one particular doctor who was making a whole lot of calls about essentially the right to live and who was rescuable and or not. And it was actually in relation to an aged care nursing facility. And there were decisions made there that are still going through the courts at the moment. So there's still a lot to resolve, and it's a very big, very long, complicated case. But I think what we saw was the idea of, yes, and for example, some of the things that were noticed were people who had acquired a disability, so people who had become injured in the, kind of emergency itself, were treated vastly differently to people who had always had a disability, people who'd always had, a physical impairment, for example. So those kinds of things really made obvious some of the ingrained beliefs that were coming to play by the people who were in the midst of a giant emergency. And again, my problem isn't necessarily with individuals making those calls, it's with the fact that nobody had thought about these things beforehand, nobody had educated people, and I'm really glad you brought up Al Gibbs, who I think has done some great work in challenging the Australian climate around that. What are we doing to prepare? What are we thinking about? What will happen when there is the next enormous fire, flood, whatever we're facing next?
But we're not actually climate change authorities, but we're storytellers. And being storytellers, we would like to include the narrative of the disabled into the mainstream. Okay, that concept of exclusionary, if you put that in a mainstream concept or context, you can actually have, like, for example, in an anthology, not just in a separate anthology which is happening next year in 2020, which is growing up disabled in Australia, like in a regular storytelling, if you have stories include the disabled as well. That's what inclusion, because we're also social media activists. We've got hashtags. Um,
So many
inclusion matters.
hashtags.
Yes, inclusion matters. This representation matters. Own stories or own voices. So these matter. So if you include us in your storytelling, include us for publishing, or for example, in libraries, just libraries, which is pretty comfortable.
I work in a library service.
Yes. We were talking about earlier how important digital libraries are, and that was in one of my talks when we launched our group, which is the Disabled Queer BIPOC Collective. My talk was about if you can't go out and you want to go to the library, surely there'll be digital, either ebooks and audiobooks right there for free. And that's what also my advocacy is. Like, I don't have the mental capacity to go out when it's too hot, but I want to read a book. I want to write, and yeah. So we need that accessibility as well in terms of the narratives, in terms of storytelling, in terms of books. Make them digital, make them print, make them in audiobooks. So everyone, it's accessible for all disabilities.
Yeah.
And I know that the libraries now are a great space for people who don't have air conditioning at home or are homeless, or if they're lonely, and they seek refuge and friendship in the staff. And someone was telling me, a library worker was telling me now that they're being trained up to assist people with like MyGov things, because people want to access their Centrelink or NDIS or different things, Medicare online. And so it's really important that, libraries don't only have books, but they have cool spaces for people to go, or heated spaces.
Yeah, no, it does make me think of, I've got so many thoughts at once. Like, I think, when I think about the disability community, there is a kind of, a really acute awareness of, that kind of non-profit thing about, we're actually not we're actually about supporting each other and getting advice from each other, and how did you work that out, and let's team up on this. But also this kind of sense that, a lot of the things that have been achieved have been through fighting government and petitioning government and corporations. So there's a real skill in not necessarily just individuals, but in collectively disability community and actually fighting for change. You talked about the NDIS, and that's only exists because people have fought for a long time. So there's perhaps some skills that can be brought to bear on the kind of climate activism. Obviously, we know that, people are doing it, but there are skills and knowledge and wisdom that can be transferred into that world, I think. Yeah.
Absolutely, and as I was saying, that fits into the whole model of, particularly in documentary filmmaking, but we are seeing it move to drama and cross-platform of social impact.
Yes.
But I feel a little bit what's happening there is often it may be individual filmmakers, but I think it would be great to actually see deaf and disabled filmmakers actually, and the same with storytellers. Like, I'm very aware there's opportunity for an anthology, not just we're going to have your poems, but an anthology of some kind would be amazing, with a whole lot of disabled writers addressing these themes, but also, for Screen Australia or Film Victoria, potentially I think there's a real room to have an initiative. There has been a couple of things through the Indigenous program, which has been fantastic at Screen Australia, particularly around Indigenous knowledge and climate change, and looking at exploring those themes. And it would be really exciting to actually have opportunities, and also like the Disrupted initiative at the ABC, where it wasn't just as much as, there's people like myself who have been to film school, and, but it's very open. I think, like I was mentioning before, that there's been a lot of barriers to why people haven't necessarily been able to make work or write or do things, particularly in the screen industry. So I think there's a lot of room. We're just scratching the surface here, I think, in terms of potential narratives, but I can sort of itch and feel so many themes.
I think disabled people as activists, as Andy pointed out, have enormous strength and knowledge there. And I think that's probably true of many marginalised communities. And I know that, for example, as Carly said, there are some times where I want to go to a march or I want to participate in an action and I can't. And a lot of the reasons that I can't are around lack of information. It might be lack of accessibility or forethought. It might be all kinds of things. But you will find, I think, that the most accessible and certainly the most well thought out in terms of wider community needs, actions that you will find in Melbourne, I don't know about the rest of Australia necessarily, is when warriors of the Aboriginal resistance run movements here or run actions here. There is always Auslan interpretation. There is always very clear information about how to meet, about how far they will travel, about how to get involved. They always live stream what they're doing. And I think that's something that the climate movement needs to learn from.
Yeah.
I think the climate movement has a long way to go when it comes to accessibility, and particularly there's this sense, it's another one of these issues where there's this sense that, well, yes, but we're so busy trying to get on with it that we don't have time to figure out all the nitty gritty. And again, it comes down to that same perspective, which is that you can just, hopefully people figure out a way to get involved themselves or deal with their own access requirements, when actually most of the time, accessibility, a lot of it comes to information. A lot of it comes to thinking differently about your action and your politics.
And it then becomes, the march or whatever looks really, really white and able-bodied. And imagine if it was actually diverse, because, it is, but it's just that visible side of things it'd be amazing spectacle.
Yeah,
Because that's us, that's the world, the city we live in.
And it's not just those in marches, but for example, you want to have a venue like here, like today, and you want to organize an event. The first thing, like our collective, what we do is the first thing we ask: do you have accessibility? Unfortunately, in BIPOC communities, there's that touch of ableism. Okay, so when I ask a person of color who's organizing an event, what do you say? Like, I don't understand what you're saying. No, I'm telling you, I'm asking you, like, do you have accessible toilet? Do you have, if you want us to go to your event, okay, do you have Auslan interpreter? Like, it doesn't cross their mind. So what we're pushing for is that for Black, Indigenous people of color, able-bodied, to include our narratives, to include our stories as well. We've got our own stories. It's not just the young and the beautiful, and we're here. We're valid. Our stories are valid. You need to hear our stories. All right, not just include us in the mainstream. That's what we're fighting for, and it's a long fight. We're just again scratching the surface. It's a long journey. It's not just a one-off thing. This discussion could even just continue on, and that's why we decided to have this collective with my fellow disabled artists, because we were pushed out from able-bodied spaces, and so that happens. So if you include us in the narrative, the disabled people of color, makes a difference.
No, absolutely, Cubby, and definitely. And I just wanted to, so I'm just going to go back to LIFA for a moment, but even though there is progress, just not just LIFA, but all of us really, like, just breaking down a notion of lot of what protest is. Just there isn't. Not to say there's some examples of accessibility, but I'm just sort of wondering some ideas around, and mindful that we are writers, but what have you seen in the climate movement that has really been done, perhaps really, I mean, you spoke to about the documentary, but you've seen some progress, or you think could, in terms of access?
Yeah, I think there has been more of a movement towards understanding that protest takes lots of forms. One of the things that I do is, and I feel sorry for my Facebook friends, but one of the things that I do is when I feel bad about not being able to go out to a protest or a physical action, I put myself through the wonderful position of going to all of the articles that are about climate change on Facebook and putting comments in those sections saying, I care about this, I'm glad that activists are out there doing this work, or, putting a comment talking about what matters to me. And I only realised recently when a friend told me, oh, you've been doing lots of commenting on articles. I was like, oh, of course my friends have been. So sorry, everybody, but you're going to have to put up with it, because that's how I feel like I can sit at home and still have my voice heard. And for some people, you can kind of make light of the idea of keyboard warriors. But what I'm doing is making sure that my voice is within that conversation, and that people who do think that, oh, it's fine, we're going to be fine, it's all a big drama over nothing, are not the only voices that are being heard. But I think one of the things that the climate movement needs, and what the disability community can do better than possibly, anyone else, is really draw the links between the inherent similarities and the focus of the disability movement is already the political challenge that we're putting up for people is the same as the climate movement does, and that is to say, can we step away from valuing everything by $1? So can we stop saying that the planet has no inherent worth unless we can put a dollar figure on it? And this is something that I think the climate movement sometimes forgets about, and they start talking about how much the green industry is worth, or how much we can save if we do X, Y, or Z. And I think the disability movement challenges people to see the inherent worth of a being and the inherent worth of a person, regardless of whether that body or mind or any part of them is typical of what we have now decided an average person is. And the climate movement needs to be putting the same challenge, and that is by saying we have a single planet, and its worth is not defined by how much dollar figure we can pull out of the ground and mine out of it, or what we can do. It's actually asking people to look beyond a capitalist framework. And that's something that the disabled community have had to do for a very long time. We're asked to prove our worth over and over and over. And so for me, those two things are so inextricably linked, and it seems so obvious to me that it's the same struggle in a different form.
Yeah, thank you, Lefa.
It's that kind of idea of biodiversity on some level, like human diversity, that everything that's lost is a whole world of loss, So I couldn't put it better.
Yeah.
We're going to come to an end soon, but I'm just mindful too, Carly, because you particularly, actually you all do, but particularly with your social media, like you have a lot of impact on things, and is this kind of what sort of is this bringing up anything for you in terms of?
I get a lot when I post pictures of my breakfast, which is often. A lot of people who are not meat eaters will tell me the impact of my food choices. People will tell me, will be very quick to tell me that a certain brand isn't, ethical in terms of climate or social good, which can be hard, but it's also quite good. It's educative. People take the time to educate. I think in terms of having the power to share share news or be very open about how I feel about the government's denial is good. For a long time, I worked at the government for 15 years and I wasn't able to say a thing, so this is like a liberating experience now. And I feel like we can all use our social media, big or small, to do that. I'm very good at, or trying to be very good or better at setting boundaries around what I can and can't do. So I reckon on an average week I'd get 3 or 4 requests from people, maybe more, to say, hey, can you share my event, or can you look at this article, or can you help me here? And one other thing, I have a standard response now when I am really busy to say, I cannot do this. I need to preserve my own energy and work and, do all the things I need to do. But if I've taught you anything, you can go and share this with your audience. So I think it's really, every little bit helps, and you can all make an impact. I think it's really great when you share something and someone says, I've never thought of it that way before, or, you know, I'm going to do this, or to help my environmental footprint. So, yeah, I think we can all do a bit on social media. But also I really like to eat breakfast. So, you know, I don't drive my car, but I do eat salmon. Sorry.
And, you know, yeah, it's that same thing again of kind of little by little you want to challenge that individualist model, and just that it's not all up to Carly to, you know, save the world, nor is it all up to me, but to collectively do something.
Yeah.
you know.
So we're coming to an end of the panel, so
Yeah.
I want to thank the panellists, Lefa, Cubby, Andy and Carly.
And you, Fiona.
thank
Thanks,
you.
Fiona. Yeah.
I want to thank our audience in the room and our audience live streaming and post this. I want to thank our Auslan interpreters, the team at AI Media, Haruki Karabashi, the Special Projects Coordinator at the Wheeler Centre. It's been amazing doing these events with you, and to all of the Wheeler Centre team, to John Boy, to everyone here. It's been fantastic. And also to all my incredible colleagues at AAV. Thank you again. And those of us that are in the room, please stick around and join us for a drink. And online, we'll definitely see you in 2020. So thank you.
Thank you.